I'm Steve Lassig. I'm just kind of working the booth here, and I'm here to introduce our keynote address, Bob West. Bob is the CEO and founder of Echelon One. It's a consulting firm that specializes in strategic thinking, in security, and a lot of work right now in the cloud. He'll be talking today on the characteristics of a highly effective information security executive. He's given this talk before. I've seen it. It's actually very well done. Bob's a very good guy, a lot of history in the security industry. He used to be the Cso of Fifth Third and Bank One, if I remember correctly, so he's a geek too. And so without further ado, Bob will be talking, and then right after that, we're going to he's going to shorten his address so we can jump into a panel discussion on cloud security. So that'll be right after that, his talk here too. So without further ado, Bob West.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, there was a point where I was actually technical, and I think 99 was the last time I remember I had this TCP/IP class, and I could actually distinguish in between TCP/IP and Ethernet headers. But that's been way too long, so I just do this thing. And as a preface, this is probably the anti-GrrCON presentation in terms of themes. So appreciate you having me. And what I'm going to talk about is the general issues that security leadership faces as an aggregate. And mileage may vary depending on who the leader is, but it's a very broad area. And one of the big things that security executives get asked is, how do you know if you're effective? How do you know you're doing a good job? So we'll go into that. And then go into the recipe for executing a good security program and keeps a long-term success. And hopefully there'll be 5 or 10 minutes towards the end for you to ask your questions. So generally speaking, one of the issues, if you look at the position of a chief security officer or chief information security officer, is where do they report? And at a very basic level, one of the things I continue to have a conversation about is, should security report within technology? And the simple answer is it shouldn't. It's very common, but it shouldn't be reporting there. Technology has a mission to deliver applications. Security and risk have a mission to keep the environment safe, right? And so if you're reporting through a CIO, availability always trumps security. And I've been through that exercise a million times. But at the end of the day, if it's a choice in between keeping an environment secure and having it available, availability always trumps that. So in an ideal world, security reports outside of technology. And depending on how mature the organization is, it could report through the chief risk officer, it could report directly to the CEO, through general counsel. The big thing is having it report outside of technology. So one of the analogies I like to give is, in quality control does not report to manufacturing, right? I mean, otherwise you tend to have some basic issues and conflicts of interest, and security is the same way. So one of the other dynamics is security is the group that says no, right? I mean, they're the business prevention unit. And so what happens is when you have initiatives that are going down the pike, security either gets skirted or they get involved at the last minute. And as a consequence, most organizations think security is expensive, which makes a lot of sense because you're being integrated, if you're being integrated at the back end. So again, going back to the quality analogy, when a car rolls off the assembly line, you don't say, let's add quality now, right? And it's a function of the manufacturing process. And if you try and put quality in afterwards, it just simply doesn't work. And if you don't have the right level of quality, then you start having defects. And if the defects are severe enough, then you start having recalls. So security functions pretty much the same way. You can't do it adding it on, bolting it on at the end. It has to be a systemic part of the business process. And if you don't have it built in up front, it does become expensive. So you think of application development. You have all these people across organizations that are coding, and most of them have not learned how to code securely. You think of when you learn at the university level, it's very rare that people get taught how to code securely. And so what happens is they get out into their organizations, start writing code, don't have the right security hygiene, and now you've got this bowl of spaghetti. And in large organizations, so for example, in my former stomping grounds, we had hundreds, if not thousands, of applications. And you've got this whole mess that's out there that basically says, I can leverage even basic things like buffer overflows or SQL injection attacks. There's all these things that are really basic things that should be taken care of, but they're not. So the other piece is communicating clearly. One of the things I hear a lot, and this goes beyond security, it goes to technology people in general, is that the executive team and board should learn security and technologies language. And that is just 180 degrees from where it should be, right? Because if you don't help a CEO or a general counsel, anyone on the executive team or on the board understand in terms that they relate to why security is important, why it should be part of the equation, they're not going to get it. And if they don't get it, you're not going to get the right level of budget or resources to fulfill the security mission. So part of security leadership and security professionals in general, I mean, their function is basically translation. And translation into, so I'm having a conversation with a CFO as an example. What does it mean to me from a top and bottom line perspective? If I'm talking to a CEO, how does this help me fulfill my strategic mission? How does it help me create strategic advantage? And there are lots of ways to do that. So as an example, there are a lot of organizations that are adopting the cloud right now. And the panel will be talking about this a little bit later. But at the end of the day, there is a substantial business value of adopting the cloud. I mean, you're literally talking orders of magnitude difference in terms of the cost of running a cloud application versus a conventional CRM or human resources or financial application. So that's something that a CFO can understand. And that's how you need to be having the conversation. And likewise, from a general counsel's perspective, what's the legal risk I'm facing? How does security help reduce my legal risk? And that's the conversation that needs to be had. There's also the issue in terms of black magic. So there's a lot of security people that keep their secrets under the kimono, right? In terms of, I think a lot of people look at it from a job protection perspective. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a very high level of transparency within the organization. And here's why we exist. Here's how we partner with you as a business. And one of the things that I see is what I like to call the Cso dysfunction. So a lot of security leaders are one security breach away from losing their job, right? And that's, I would say, is north of 80% of security leaders are in that situation. At the same time, let's say you have a strong security leader. You have a security breach, the person gets fired. I mean, you've just increased your risk posture as an organization. But the more important thing to understand is that you can't prevent security breaches, right? And think of the general counsel, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but think of the general counsel in their position. You can't prevent lawsuits from happening, right? I mean, it's just an impossibility. But what you can do is you can bring together a strong legal framework so when lawsuits happen, you reduce the legal risk, litigation, settlement costs, etc. And that's the model that security should be following. So I'll get into that a little bit more later. A lot of people also have a tactical focus. I'd say north of 2/3 of the organizations that I see just don't have a fundamental strategic plan. So where are we now? What does Nirvana look like? How do I get there? What am I going to do in 2012, 2013, 2014? What's the logical approach I need to take in terms of executing my security program? So if you start taking a look at these different issues up here, all of this translates into lack of visibility. If I'm not reporting in the right place organizationally, if I'm not communicating clearly, if I'm perceived as the business prevention unit, if I am following the black magic mentality, I'm not going to get in front of the executive team. I'm not going to get in front of the board. And unless I'm in front of them on a regular basis, things are just not going to happen. The final thing is that I see a lot that there are some very strong technologists that they perform exceptionally well, and as a reward, they get put into a management or executive role. And all technologists are not good CSOs. Think of it in accounting. All accountants don't necessarily make good CFOs. There are leadership traits that go along with that. And part of that is really being honest with yourself and not only saying, what do I want to be when I grow up, right? But the second thing is, do I have the capacity to be a good executive? And a lot of people don't see that. I mean, in one of my past experiences, there was a gentleman, one of my colleagues, and his mission was to be a CIO. A great guy, very good technical guy. He did not have the chops to be a CIO, and there was just black and white. But he did not internalize it, didn't understand it, and so I mean, he had some significant issues. So part of it is, as an organization, you want to say, you know, does this technologist really have the capacity to be a good executive? So going back to, you know, how do I know if I'm being effective? So one of the basic things that security and risk professionals need to communicate is what's the business value that security brings to the table. And if you look at things from a corporate priority perspective, one of the basic things that organizations value is the image of their brand and their reputation. And that's one of the things that security can really enhance, right? If I have the right controls in place, if I'm doing commercially reasonable things to protect an environment, that's going to allow me to protect the organization's brand and image. So one of the things that I don't think most executives understand is, as a corporation, I'm running on technology, right? And if I take that technology away, you know, whether I'm a manufacturing company or a financial services company, I'm going to stop functioning. I mean, that's the reality. And yet we have this technology that has pervasive security issues across the board. And so you have a lot of issues that go along with that, right? I mean, so you have nation states like China that are systemically stealing intellectual property. Well, what does that mean to me as a corporation in the long term? You know, what does it mean to me if my competitors have my intellectual property or my customer list, right? I mean, that really threatens me from just from a company liability perspective. And those are things that need to be exceptionally clear to the organization, is we can partner with you and create a resilient business environment. So I was talking about strategic planning before. If strategic plans are done correctly, they're aligned with both business and technology strategies. So when I put together my strategic plans, or we've helped our clients put together their strategic plans, the first thing we understand is, you know, what are the strategic plans for the business? And if most organizations have discipline, they're going to say, well, here are top 3, top 5 priorities for the year. So then the technology organization gets in, and, okay, well, here's how we can help you partner and deliver these business initiatives. And if the stars align, security is in the mix of that conversation and says, well, here's how we can help deliver secure business solutions. So when I've done my strategic plans, I always bring different people into the mix. So I'll typically have someone from human resources, from legal, someone from the business, either the CIO or a direct report to the CIO. And that really allows you to have the right people in the room and establish a dialogue and get to the right level in terms of aligning security with business and technology strategy. So I was talking about the general counsel model earlier. A general counsel fundamentally is there to coach the business in terms of legal risk. So I'm pursuing a particular initiative. You know, here's the legal risk that exists. And it's the business's choice to accept whether they're going to follow the general counsel's advice or not. But at the end of the day, the general counsel doesn't accept the risk, it's the business. And I was talking about the Cso dysfunction with the CSO having the target on their back. The CSO should really function in that way. Security executives should be coaching the business. So we have a particular business initiative, or we're refreshing technology. Well, here's the right way to do it. And there's some things from a policy perspective that you absolutely have to do. Then there are things that are variable. And at the end of the day, businesses exist to make money. I mean, you know, that's you know, unless you're a not-for-profit, right? But for-profit businesses are there to make money. And to make money, you've got to take risks. But they have to be calculated. And that's what is typically missing in the translation, and the counsel is not being given. So the security leaders should be giving the business counsel in terms of, here's the security risk that exists. And if I were in your shoes, this is what I would do. But it's the business that needs to accept the risk, right? And that's the correct model that should be followed. And again, like lawsuits, you can't prevent lawsuits from happening. You can't prevent security breaches from happening. And I think a really good example of that, Siobhan Gorman from the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about a year and a half ago. The crux of it was there are about 2,500 companies globally that the Chinese can tap into. And it's a really interesting conversation as you're going into the cloud that people say, well, I don't want to adopt the cloud because it's probably not as secure as my environment. Well, there's basically a lack of security in most environments to begin with, right? So am I actually increasing my security posture if I go to the cloud, or am I reducing it, or is it neutral? And that's an interesting conversation to have. So if you look at most parts of an organization, there are very clear metrics in terms of how different departments in an organization are measured. So you think of a CFO. Are we making money? Do we have our expenses under control? Do we have enough focus on marketing so we can make more money? There's an exceptional amount of clarity in terms of how they're measured. Security generally is not the same way. And yet, going back to how does the top of the house perceive me as a partner? How do I get measured? And there isn't a lot of clarity around there. There's metrics. There's multiple sets of metrics that you can use. So the board and the executive team have a different set of metrics than the CIO or a CTO. And the board and the executive team want to understand, do I have the right number of resources? Do I have the right budget? What are my priorities? Am I doing the right things to minimize risk to the organization? Because I don't want to end up in the left-hand column of the Wall Street Journal or on CNN or pick your favorite media outlet, right? That's just not good for the business. So mature organizations have pretty clear metrics in terms of whether they're doing their job well. And again, going back to, there's a very strong theme here in terms of clear business communication. It needs to be communicated very clearly in terms that the executive team can understand. And I'm actually going through a process right now with a global company. I would think that as large an organization as they are, that there would be clarity because they've got visibility to the board and to the executive team, but the message isn't really clear. So a year from now, 2 years from now, it's going to be very difficult for them if they follow their current model to measure whether they're successful or not. So it needs to be transparent and it needs to be measured very clearly in terms that the organization across the board can understand. One of the final things is that security needs to have a comprehensive approach. So you think of ISO 27000 as a model. And I actually think that that's a really good model to follow in general because it's something that's internationally accepted, it's comprehensive, and going back to legal risk. Sooner or later there's going to be a security breach. And sooner or later there's going to be a lawsuit. And sooner or later I'm going to end up in court. Well, if I can say that I'm following a methodology that's comprehensive, that's internationally accepted, and if I'm doing something that's commercially reasonable, I'm spending enough money, and I have the right number of resources, that's going to reduce my legal risk as a whole. I'm going to reduce the litigation cost. It's going to be as minimally disruptive to the organization. And so then the other piece along that is, do I have a good plan to respond to things when things go bump in the night? Because they will. And do I have the right people engaged within the organization? So one of the big misses that I see is communications people aren't always involved in an incident response process. So going back to the media is going to come and say, okay, so what's going on here with the security breach? Well, if the organization is not prepared to answer that question, perception is reality. I can say the wrong thing as a corporation to the media, and it may not be clear, it may be misperceived. It could not be the reality. It may not be the reality. And so having communications as part of the incident response process needs to be there. And finally, security and risk need to be integrated into the fundamental business process. So you think of who are the stakeholders in an enterprise that have a lot of say in things? Well, you have people such as system administrators. Do I have security built into a standard build? Do I have a standard build in terms of implementing desktop servers, router infrastructure, etc.? Do I have an application development lifecycle? Is security part of that? Do I have toll gates within the development lifecycle that says, if things aren't done well, then we stop things and fix things. Project managers have a lot of influence. And again, that goes on the wild assumption that you have a project management methodology. But again, baking it into the project management methodology, so you have all the stakeholders nodding as you go from stage to stage, says, yeah, we're good with everything. And if we're not,
It's right after.
we need to address things.
You'll see, it's involved.
So again, going back to, again, think of quality again. So to get to nirvana, and this is the recipe that we think you need to follow. So governance is the foundation for everything. If you think of anything that's going to impact an enterprise in a very broad context, you have to have the right conversation going at the right level, and ideally as far up as you can go. So in most security programs that I've been a part of that we've implemented, we've had visibility to the board. And once it's important to the board, it becomes important to the executive team. And you get the right level of resources. You also, again, have to have the right people around the table to have a good conversation. So once you've engaged those people, then you can start setting the rules of the road. You set policy for the organization. And ideally, you get everybody into a room at the right level. Everyone says, yes, these policies make sense for us. And policies are going to vary based on an industry profile. So good policy for a financial services company doesn't necessarily mean it's good policy for a manufacturing company or a pharmaceutical company. Or the fact that things are good in an intelligence community in the federal government doesn't necessarily translate otherwise. So you set policy that makes sense for the organization. And once you set policy, then you need to let people know what the policy is. So that's where awareness and education come in. In a very broad context, I think there's a significant miss in most organizations because most people have come from a technology background in security. Their instinctive reaction is, okay, what tool do I need to buy to solve this problem? And at the end of the day, what you're trying to achieve is managing human behavior. What does an employee need to do on a day-to-day basis as part of their job to protect information? And it varies based on who they are. So you've got things that a garden variety employee can do. There are things that the executive team needs to do. There are things that technology people need to do. So there's multiple messages that need to be communicated early and often. The other thing that I see is that people may get a sprinkling of awareness and education as they go through new employee orientation. So if you think in most large companies, I probably go through a couple of days of pretty intense information overload in that period, and I probably get 10 to 15 minutes, if I'm lucky, in terms of security awareness. And boom, that's where it stops. So you think of, do I remember that a month from now, much less from a year from now? Probably not. And then you have to look at an organization as a whole. A typical organization has about 20% turnover on an annual basis. And then there are parts of organizations, like in financial services, you think of tellers and call center employees in general, typically have somewhere between 50 to 100% turnover on an annualized basis. So if I hit them in new employee orientation a year from now, I'm going to have at least 1 out of 2, if not everybody, that's new. And so now I've got a workforce that doesn't understand what they need to be doing to protect information. So the message is, it's got to be early and often, it's got to be in small chunks, it has to be in language they can understand. I had this conversation going on with one of my bosses, and he loved to use flowery language like inculcate, promulgate, and things like that. And well, all those H's don't necessarily mean a whole lot to someone that has a high school education, right? So as well intentioned as they may be, you've got to communicate in clear, simple language. And managing human behavior at the end of the day is what you need to achieve. If people don't understand what they need to do as part of their day-to-day job, it's a significant miss. So once you have that in place, then you can start saying, okay, I've got policies, standards, awareness, and education. Then I can start taking a look at things architecturally, and I can start making some architectural decisions. So as an example, if I have a garden variety application, I have a lot of web applications. Nirvana says that I'm controlling authentication consistently across my application portfolio. So that's where things like web single sign-on come in. And I can set some standards that says, for any web application that I'm writing, it's going to use our web single sign-on framework. And I can get more specific about that. But those are the types of things that if security architecture is done right, it gets baked into technology architecture. Now that in of itself is a separate discussion. I'm really amazed that there are a lot of organizations that don't understand the value of technology architecture. So the way I like to explain it is, you think of a physical structure, you think of this physical structure. And one of the first things that's done when you build a structure is you engage an architect. And if you skip that step and go and build the structure, then the probability of that structure having the right level of integrity goes way down. And I probably wouldn't want to come into this building, right, if that stuff was missed. I probably wouldn't know it. On the other hand, I might just by physical clues. And yet you think of technology infrastructure, and it's probably more complex than a physical structure. And unless I have the good, solid architecture, whether it's network architecture, application architecture, pick the different facets that you have, if I don't have consistency and I don't have clear delineation, it makes it close to impossible for me to protect the environment, provide availability to the organization. And so fundamentally, there's got to be a good technology architecture. Otherwise, it makes security really hard. And then security gets baked into technology architecture. So once you get past that, then you can do technology selection. You pick your favorite firewalls, IPSs, and then I implement it. And I need to make sure that I have the right resilience built into it, because things happen. You know, hurricanes happen, earthquakes on the East Coast happen. They don't happen very often. But you think of nuclear plants being shut down in Virginia because of that, right? And that was pretty light. Interestingly, I think it was back in 2008, and it was during Hurricane Ike, I think it was. Everyone was preparing to take care of New Orleans and Texas. And in Ohio, where I live, we sent a lot of personnel from the power companies down to Texas and Louisiana, so when the hurricanes came in, they'd have enough resources to help get things back up and running. But the problem was the winds from the hurricanes came through the Midwest at 60, 70, 80 miles per hour, and there was a point where there were, I want to say it was close to 2 million people had no power in Ohio, in some cases up to about a week. And there were a couple of Fortune 500 companies that I know of in Ohio that had no business continuity or disaster recovery plan. So people were driving into the parking lot, there was no power in the building. So how do I do things? And the lesson learned is that things happen, there's power disruption. I was talking to a gentleman earlier where they had an electrician working in their data center and things went poof. So how do I respond to that? How do I make sure that not only I have availability for the corporation, but I continue to keep a secure environment? And that's one of the things that as you're putting together disaster recovery plans, there's a lot of people that say, well, we need to keep things simple in a disaster. We need to get rid of our IDs and passwords and share things. Well, no, I mean, that's the time when you're most vulnerable, right? And you've got to have consistent process. It has to be consistent with what you do on a day-to-day basis, and you have to have the right stakeholders involved. So then you're talking about vulnerability management in a broad context. You need to have the right antivirus in place, you need to have firewalls, IPS, you need to have the right process in place so when things go bump in the night, that you can control them. And just from a business perspective, so what does it cost you as a business if I have a disruption to my infrastructure? And that answer is going to vary wildly depending on who you are. But if I'm let's say I'm a trading floor, and I'm trading hundreds of thousands, if not millions of transactions in a very short period of time. And trading floors can lose millions, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in a very short period of time. So a disaster recovery and business continuity plan for a trading floor is significantly different. And then you have to start taking a look at, so what applications do I have? So on the other end of the spectrum, I've got a payroll application. How often do I pay my workforce? Well, it's probably once a week, twice a month, every 2 weeks, something like that. And my disaster recovery plan for a payroll application is going to be radically different than for a trading floor. So again, it's where am I within the organization? So then everything that I've done to implement security and risk, I need to go back and look at it regularly, because what I implemented a year ago, 2 years ago, may or may not necessarily be relevant. I've got organizational changes, I may do an acquisition, I may do a divestiture, I may have just a fundamental change in technology. So going back to, you go back through the process. Do my policies make sense? Do my standards make sense? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did you have a question? No. So in terms of keys to long-term success, as an enterprise, you have to take a look at things from a global perspective. And one of the things that a lot of organizations do well is they look at enterprise risk from several facets. They're probably looking at credit risk, they're looking at geopolitical risk, they're looking at economic risk, but they're probably not looking at technology risk. And that's a typical miss in most organizations. So to be looking at things from a comprehensive perspective, you have to be looking at what is my total risk posture as an organization. One of the things that a lot of people don't understand at an executive level is one of the most important things is managing relationships, spending time with the executive team, spending time with the right stakeholders that have influence, and people that are managing that program office, application development lifecycle, et cetera. And making sure, again, if I haven't communicated enough, I'm going to communicate it one more time. Communicate, communicate, communicate in language that the stakeholder understands. Mileage may vary depending on the person that I'm speaking to. Again, going back to what are the business imperatives to an organization? What is important to me as a business? And how do I support the business in terms of rolling out strategic business initiatives? You need to measure performance. And one of the things that if you're doing things right in a security culture, one of the things that people really listen to is, what type of raise am I going to get? What's my bonus? And those are things that people really, really pay attention to. So if you can bake security into performance evaluations, and that's where human resources comes in. That's one of the things that they can do. They can also help enforce policies. So you think of pornography in the workplace. I mean, that's creating a hostile work environment. So having a conversation where security partners with the human resources organization say, we've got a problem, what can security do? Well, they can help monitor a particular individual that has an issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are multiple things that you can do in terms of partnering with the business. And managing those relationships and really setting expectations clearly in terms of here's how we work with you as a stakeholder is incredibly important. So again, going back to looking at things that go bump in the night, there are a lot of things that happen. I mean, even just from a geopolitical perspective. So think of the things that have happened this last year, right? You've got the Arab Spring. You have financial issues, not just in the United States, but in Europe. So right now, if you look at things economically, one of the things that's causing people a lot of pain is what's going to happen with Greece. Is Europe going to step in and help them out? Those things fundamentally impact organizations. It impacts their budgets. If people aren't clear about what's going to happen economically, they're going to be very conservative. You may not necessarily get the budget that you want. They may not hire people, and that's one of the basic issues that we're experiencing economically right now. That's a much longer conversation. But at the end of the day, those are things that you need to be attuned to. So as there are different things, what are nation-state issues, doing scenario planning, where do we do business? If I'm doing business in the Middle East, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in China, what does it mean to me in terms of protecting the organization? There's a large company that I'm having an initial dialogue with, and they don't appreciate the issue that China has. Like it or not, it's a really big problem. And I've been giving this one presentation for about 6 years now. It's a quote from, I think it was Newsweek. And the basic instruction that Chinese companies get from the government is they need to do everything within their power to gain competitive advantage. And part of it is stealing intellectual property. It's what's going to gain me a global competitive advantage. So this company I'm referring to, they did an acquisition in China. And their perception is, well, I own this entity, therefore they're under my control. And no, they're not. When you look at things from a Chinese culture perspective, the thing that Chinese value the most is supporting the state. I mean, that is number one. That's the culture they grew up in. So anything that helps further the state's interest is what people are indoctrinated. That is innately what they will do. And from a cultural perspective, that doesn't make sense to a lot of us, but that's the reality in terms of doing business globally and doing business in China. And even if you're not doing business in China, going back to what I said earlier, there's 2,500 companies globally that the Chinese can tap into. So what does that mean to me as an organization? What do I need to do? Do I have tools to allow me to look at advanced persistent threats, which is one of the big things that most organizations just simply don't see. So reviewing plans on a regular basis, again, I said that earlier, and modifying them as necessary. Again, do I do an acquisition? Does the organization change? That's what you need to do. And at the end of the day, the real simple thing is you've got to have the right combination of people, process, and tools. There's an old friend of mine, an ex-Gartner analyst, Bill Malik. He came up with a scenario in terms of getting a very simple understanding of an organization's security culture. And the scenario is you have an employee and they see something unusual. And you can ask 3 questions. First of all, do they understand it's unusual? Do they know how to report it? And would they choose to report it? And if you can answer yes to those 3 questions, then you've got a pretty good security culture. If you answer no to any one of those, there's some work to do. So that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them right now. Yes?
Bob, you talked about the partnership between Spring and the rest of the executive team.
Yep.
And I believe that as well, that they need to be partners. But what I see is, to me, a true partnership is shared risk. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and the question is, partnership is sharing risk, absolutely.
So we're going to share risk. So the things we agree on, the outcome is either beneficial to all of us or detrimental to all of us. I don't for all. The challenge I see there is a security officer has one reach and is fired.
Yep.
The executive team made up of finance and sales and marketing and CEO and all that, has a bad quarter, spins it, is not fired.
Yep.
So they can make mistakes. Security officer can. So what are you recommending from a metric standpoint to really tighten up that relationship so that, because if I'm a security officer, what I'm going to do then is, because I need to survive, right? We're all
right there, Cso Dysfunction, and that's what he's talking about.
Because what I'll do then, and what I see in my business then, I sell technology and I promote technology and I want to move my clients up that food chain. They're resistant because they take on more risk, which in their case they pay more. What are you recommending then they can do? What type of match? What can they do that they can say, okay, I can survive bad news as well. Give me a chance to make a mistake, like firing off. Because what they do is they say, I'll do nothing. I'll put a fortress around it. And then what they end up doing is they stick their feet in the ground. They just dig in and say at the next meeting, they go, we want to advance these markets, we want to do this, we want to acquire here, we want to be global. Hey, as a security officer, I think we know that risk because all of you want that because we can bigger bonuses. I only have to, yes, I may get a bonus, but if I fail once, I'm out. And then I can set my predecessor up. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
What they should talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what can a CSO or a security executive do to prevent the Cso dysfunction? And part of it is setting expectations realistically up front. Again, going back to, you can't prevent lawsuits from happening, you can't prevent security breaches. And that's just not reality. So that's step number 1. The second step is, I think there's a lot of security people that see security and risk as binary. There's risk or there isn't, right? And that's, again, that's not reality, right? Businesses are going to take risks to make money. And the question becomes, do I have the right dialogue with the executive team to say, I'm pursuing a particular business initiative? What are the security risks? What should I be doing? What's commercially reasonable to protect the organization? The business needs to make the decision if I'm doing an acquisition, right? I mean, that's not the security person's job. The security person can point out and say, look, these guys are crazy. They're not doing the right things to protect the organization. It's going to cost us a lot of money to bring them up to snuff, to our standards. But that's something that the business is going to make the decision on. It's like, it's worth it to me from a financial perspective to make that acquisition. Maybe it costs me $10, $20 million to invest in security. But let's say I can add a couple $100 million to the bottom line through this acquisition. From a financial perspective, that makes a lot of sense. right? So, but it's the business that's going to make the decision to accept that risk. It's not the security executive that's going to make that decision. And the other piece to it, if you're talking about acquisitions, is that security needs to be baked into the acquisition process. And again, there's a lot of organizations that don't have an acquisition playbook. So step number one, if you don't have one, you need one. And when you have one, security needs to be part of that. And there's just a lot of business value. And again, going back to enabling the business, what happens if I have the right identity management infrastructure? Can I import information from the target's human resources database into mine? And if I use that as an authoritative source for my employees, and there may be multiple ones, but I can get them integrated into my infrastructure much more quickly. What happens if I have a consistent directory infrastructure, right? I can help facilitate the acquisition and lower the costs. So we had, there were some businesses that we acquired at my last stomping grounds. It took close to 18 months to integrate into the business. And when you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar company, I mean, you're talking literally hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent for the acquisition and integration process. Shortening that process to 3 months, to 2 months, is a huge cost savings. Not only in terms of integration cost, but the ability to function as one business. So there's huge business value there. So hopefully somewhere in there I answered your question. Great. Any other questions?
I'll get a mic here.
Going once? Going
You're right,
twice?
Mike, if anybody wants it.
Yes? No? Maybe?
Okay.
Are you
Thank
waiting?
you.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.
For you, if you want to just wait about 5 minutes, we're going to set up and then we'll start. We're going to do a cloud security panel discussion to answer your questions and also present the issues around the cloud. I always think of the fantasy island commercial of the plane, and everybody's going around going, the cloud. So this session is really to be able to get our experts up here. Bob West will be one of them, to talk about the cloud.